That was a great talk, Durak. And I'll start off from the prairie and end up in a perspective from the desert grasslands of the Southwest. And I'll also start with sort of the broad observation that our responses to transformation ultimately depend on conceptual or mental models of ecosystem change. And those models are continuing to expand over time. These models determine how we understand the possible futures of an observed ecosystem and the management decisions that we use to preserve or produce a desired future state. So in the early 20th century, that model that we used was the range condition or the succession-retrogression model. And there was the assumption of a single equilibrium plant community for a site. There was a predictable rate of return to an equilibrium composition when you could adjust drivers that were under your control, like grazing pressure or fire. The objective was to manage for a steady state, and a key assumption was that there was climate stationarity over management time scales. Climate stationarity really refers to the statistical properties of climate variables that do not change over time. So you can see in this graph on the left, a stationary pattern where the mean is the same and the variability is similar over time, and then a shift across that dashed line to a non-stationary pattern where there may be, with regard to management responses, a coping range, a zone that's a little, or at least sometimes outside of that normal pattern, and then of course an extreme set of conditions that can cause state transitions. So the state and transition model, of course, was an advance in the late 20th century that acknowledged multiple stable community equilibria for a site, that thresholds and feedbacks may require intensive restoration to recover desired states. And you can manage for multiple states if you want, but like the succession-retrogression or range condition model, the state and transition model has also assumed climate stationarity in most applications. I refer to this as the circularity of stationarity, in which the models seem to imply a stationary environment in which full restoration is possible if you can overcome those local restoration thresholds. And so you see this pattern of going from a reference state to an intermediate stable state that may degrade to a highly altered state, and then you can get yourself back to the reference state. This type of approach to state and transitions is beginning to be reconsidered through what has been referred to by Steve Jackson in a science paper last year as transformational ecology. And the application of transformation ecology has been referred to as the RAD, Resist, Accept, Direct framework. And this is a really innovative and very productive way of thinking about states and transitions in a non-stationary environment, where you have three options to choose from a particular state. You can either resist this inexorable change that's being caused by climate change or other forces, where you're trying to maintain or restore a current or historical ecosystem state under changing conditions. You can accept the change, go with the flow, and allow that change to happen without intervention, or you can direct the change, where you're intervening to encourage change toward new ecosystems with desirable characteristics. You're letting it change, but you're trying to steer the change to the degree that you can do that. And so what this leads to in thinking about RAD, the RAD framework in a state and transition model context, is a tree-like state and transition model, where you may be coming from a historical state. You're in the yellow current state. And the question is whether once you're in the current state, you resist, you accept, or you direct to different states, and then acknowledge that future state options are going to be contingent on previous decisions as well as natural events like droughts. So under this framework, equilibria are often temporary. Those thresholds and feedbacks locally may constrain the ability to guide trajectories from a particular state. We can apply these RAD decision options, and we acknowledge that climate non-stationarity is going to influence our management trajectories. So what I'm going to do with that background is talk a little bit about thinking about this framework in desert grasslands of the southwestern United States by reviewing some results from the Jornada experimental range where I work, as well as some studies we have in surrounding grasslands and what the implications are about how we might be managing transitions from perennial grasslands toward shrub and bare ground dominated states, which is our primary problem in this region. So I'll start with a description of the Jornada permanent chart quadrat study, which gives us some perspective on the drivers of change. This is a long-term study based upon 122 quadrats that were established from 1915 to 1927 that have been remeasured annually until 1979. We had very dense data, and then it was discontinued, and then fortunately picked up again by Chris Havstad in 1995, and we've been remeasuring these quadrats every 5 years, most recently this past year. So we have 106 years of total data on vegetation change across the Jornada. The method that was used was a pantograph that provides very precise measurement of cover and species presence. So what this lacks in extent of measurement, it makes up for in detail. And of course, we have 122 of these quadrats across the Jornada. So one of the things that we wanted to investigate was how grass cover has been changing. And we know it's been highly variable as illustrated in this graph, but really the drivers have been poorly understood. Certainly we see from 1916 to 1979 in blue there, the collapse in the 1950s that has been documented in many studies and that has been attributed to poor grazing management during a drought episode. But we also wanted to ask, could climate variability also be a primary cause of not only the drop in the 1950s, but some of these other variations that we see in this time series. So we tested a number of climate variables: temperature, annual rainfall in winter and summer, standardized precipitation and evaporation index, as well as an ENSO related index. And this one was one that we had never looked at before, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, which is an index of Pacific sea surface temperature variability that is similar to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. And in the Southwest, the warm phase, shown in red in that graph below, produces more moist conditions, and the cool phase in blue there produces more dry conditions. So this is a multi-decadal scale of variability that's pretty well matched to the multi-decadal record of vegetation that we have from the Jornada quadrats. So we tested a variety of these models, and it turns out that the PDO index alone is the best model. So it's very highly correlated to variations in grass cover from 1916 to 79. And we see here that the 1950s grass collapse can be adequately explained by this climate teleconnection. And so the next question is grass going to recover with a shift to a positive PDO index? And so what we've done here is in this left graph is to predict what we would expect in grass cover on the y-axis there based upon the data from 1916 to 1979, and then compare those with those dots in the lower right, which are the observed grass cover records. So the dots are observed, and that line, that black line with the confidence interval is predicted. And what we're seeing is that our observed records fall far below what the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index would predict based upon its relationship to data from 1916 to 1979. And this period, this shift after 1979 corresponds to increasing temperatures shown in that top right graph, as well as a landscape level increase in shrub dominance that we also see inside of those quadrants. We also see that core species such as Bouteloua, eriopoda, black grama are a declining share of grasses over time. We see this gradual replacement of the core species in this graph shown in yellow by transients, especially Sporobolus species, as well as Aristid or Threon species since the 1950s. So even though, as you look at this graph, there was a little bit of an increase in the late 60s and the early 70s before the end of our dense record, we see here that black grama and some of these core species in other parts of the landscape were a declining fraction of those species that were able to recover. When recovery does occur on eroded soils, for example, those former dominants like black grama tend to be replaced by other species. That top series is a set of changes that we're studying on sandy soils, where we know from historical records that it went from black grama to sort of bare ground dominated area with mesquite. And then during an extreme rainfall event in 2006 to 2009, we saw grass recovery, but not black grama, other types of species like bush muley, Muhlenbergia porteri. The alternative pathway on the Jornada is to non-native layman lovegrass, and we're seeing that species expand into some of these areas that transitioned previously from black grama to mostly bare ground. So the next question is, can shrub removal catalyze the recovery of grasses? Can we try to recover black grama or any grasses by removing shrubs and perhaps take advantage of favorable rainfall periods? This is something that we've been examining as a part of the Restore New Mexico Collaborative Monitoring Program with the Bureau of Land Management. And this really constitutes, in the RAD terminology, of an attempt to resist this inexorable change toward shrub domination that we're seeing in the Southwest. We assessed restoration effects across Southwest New Mexico in a number of paired treatments and controls with 5 years of duration in our monitoring records from each of those sites, and looking specifically at the effects of tebuthyron that were used, a chemical that was used to control shrubs, largely creosote bush. What we see in these monitoring data is that total grass cover does in fact increase on treatments while declining on the untreated controls, that ruderal grass species are the primary species that are increasing in the treatments. That's the graph in the lower right, where we see fluff grass, Dasycloa pulchella, really responds quite well to the treatment. If you look in the lower right, our bunch and suffrutescent grasses, the historically dominant species across this range of ecological sites, did not increase, but they did not decline as much, suggesting that the treatments are increasing resilience to drought that has affected most of these plots during this 5-year time period that we've been monitoring them. We also looked at restoration effects along an elevation gradient, which tends to take us from very warm and dry conditions to cooler and more mesic conditions with elevation. And what we see is that the most consistent increases in historically dominant grasses are occurring at higher elevations. So that's the graph on the left, and you can see that positive relationship with grass recovery. So what we're seeing on the y-axis is the increase in foliar cover due to the herbicide treatment. So the treatment essentially minus the control. We see that we can have loss even at low elevation. So at very low elevation, sometimes the treatments actually lose cover for some reason. On the other hand, we see that forb canopy cover tends to increase in those low elevation sites, much more so than it does at higher elevations. So if we take this idea and interpret it in the RAD type framework, we see that shrub control in desert grasslands, which is really one of our primary means to manipulate these transformations directly, certainly aims to resist, and applications to wetter, cooler sites sometimes constitute resistance, that we're able to preserve our perennial grasslands. And sometimes, on the other hand, it can be directing to novel grass communities. We may not be replacing the species that were formerly there, but we're replacing perennial grasses that are able to stabilize soils, provide forage, and provide desirable ecosystem services. Applications of brush management to drier and hotter sites, on the other hand, might constitute directing toward forb communities that are now replacing what were formerly perennial grass dominated sites before the shrubs encroached. And treatments that may be aiming to increase grasses in dry, hot sites might be misdirecting, such that acceptance would have led to a better outcome. And I'll explain what I mean there. And that is that we need to consider the next iteration of state transitions in RAD decisions, not the ones that we made just now, but what the consequences of those decisions are going to be in the long term. For example, we may see that a treatment is initially successful. We go from a shrubland to a community that's dominated by perennial grasses, not necessarily the perennial grasses that were there historically, but perennial grasses nonetheless. But hot droughts of the future might limit the survival of these communities, leading us to ask, would accepting these shrubland states that, while not providing many ecosystem services, may have limited wind erosion and provided for net primary production in these sites, would those shrublands have been a better option if the alternative is eventually going to be bare ground? So I'll conclude with these observations that desert grasslands are undergoing a directional trend toward increasing aridity, and we have to consider management with regard to state transitions in the context of this progressive aridification, that a triage approach to RAD decisions that's linked to state transition models may be a productive way for us to frame management options under rapid change. We have to consider that any near-term decisions that we make may constrain our future decisions or provide for opportunities in the future as well. But we don't really understand that sequence very, very well. And we really need to link monitoring with modeling in order to do that. And then, of course, we're going to have collaborative monitoring as well as collaborative adaptive management to be able to adjust those decisions, considering the variety of value systems that are going to be at play as these systems change in the future. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you for listening.